This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Our first virtual Defence and Security Studies event of the fall 2024 season features Captain Alexander Landry of the Canadian Army speaking on 3 years with NATO, lessons learned.
NATO was, for different periods of time, very relevant, extremely relevant, and for some time almost irrelevant. And people wondered about what the future of NATO would be. Did it have any real role to play? You know, my war, of course, was Afghanistan, and that was a NATO operation that was really out of theater. Afghanistan was not considered to be, a NATO focus, but it fell into Afghanistan. It tried to bring to bear the capabilities of NATO and the allies' efforts to deal with the issues in Afghanistan. Ultimately, I'm afraid I had to conclude in my doctoral thesis that it didn't work. That had nothing to do with the efforts that NATO made at the time, but it was a very complex situation. Along comes the invasion of the Crimea in 2014, and all of a sudden everybody's ears pricked up. And the next thing you know, we're into February of 2022 and the outright invasion of Ukraine itself. I shouldn't say that because Crimea was part of Ukraine, but I think you understand what I'm saying. And all of a sudden, NATO became maximal relevant, and President Joe Biden in the States pulled together a lot of effort to ensure that NATO would be supporting Ukraine. And that's kind of where we are today. But NATO, of course, is walking a tight line in terms of trying to support Ukraine to the maximal point without actually trying to draw in Russia into a NATO versus Russia outright war. So we have lots of things to think about, and Alex is going to help us through that by describing his experience and focusing on the lessons learned and drawing some broader conclusions about that. I will talk to you more about future events when we get to the end. I'm not going to read Alex's bio. It's on the flyer. It's very impressive. He's right now if you're not familiar with this, it's the Army Operational Course. So as a captain, this is an important check in the box for him to become promoted to major, which I have no doubt that he'll be as soon as possible. And I'm sure he'll end up outranking me big time. That's okay. Not hard to do. So with that, let me turn this now over to Alexander Landry. We're really, really happy to have you address our membership tonight. And we're thankful to have you back in Canada, safe and sound. And we're looking forward to your future participation with our committee and the RCMI in general. So Alex, over to you.
I'm glad to be back. Thank you so much, Dr. Eustace, especially considering, the discussions we've had about already future events. So it's great to always be able to contribute to this. It's a little weird for me, my first real one as a panelist or even a speaker myself, as usually I'm on the other side moderating, with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy or various other ones we've done. I am glad to see we actually have about a dozen participants, and this will go up afterwards on YouTube on the channel there, because it makes it for a more, I think, private conversation we can have here. And I'll get into that in a moment in terms of what my goal really is here today. So really welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to have everyone here to speak about NATO along those kinds of lines of efforts. And this will actually segue a little bit into some research I'm doing right now that I'll be happy to share at a future time at a future event. I do want to thank my colleagues from AOC right now that are listening in from the building. So it's ironic that we were able to link that up. The RCMI, working obviously with CFC in some capacities, but obviously the Command Staff College here in Kingston, as we're on the Army Operations course. And you'll see some, I think, criterion aspects of what we've learned so far in the slides as I was building it between courses, evidently. But I'm not any PowerPoint ranger as of yet. That being said, I do want to thank Dr. Eustace for having me on board. So when I approached him with a dear friend and academic peer of mine, Alexander Fremis, to provide an article, ironically, on the Arctic and then on AUKUS in 2021, it was actually my first time publishing an academic journal article in SETREP. And that would kind of lead on to lots of things that we've gotten into since then, obviously in those 3 years. But it was Dr. Eustace that gave me my first real break in that academic sphere, got me interested in it, was supportive of me undertaking now the Master of International Affairs at King's College London, which I will speak to in just a moment. And it kind of leads us to where we've come today in terms of speaking about my experience from the past 3 years spent with NATO. So quickly kind of getting into that for the Virtual Defense and Security Studies evening, about 2 months ago, I published an article on LinkedIn that spoke to my time, my experience at NATO. And then I'll explain that in a few slides about why I published that article. But it did gain some traction, and then it was a discussion between myself and Dr. Eustace that did lead to us having an evening like this, because I'm happy to provide some insight and kind of like underline the points that I brought forward in that article that was published on LinkedIn, but also provide the opportunity to kind of meld in some information and research and some current affairs that have to do with NATO, obviously, and what Canada's place is in it as one of the alliance members. Specifically speaking to that, Dr. Eustace referenced NATO's utility and the ongoing changes. And it's crazy to say, really, that in 2021, towards the end of the year, as I had come into Allied Land Command, which I'll speak to in a moment, we saw some radical changes and NATO kind of kick into high gear. Fresh off those comments from French President Emmanuel Macron about NATO being brain dead, and the cause célèbre and the whole savoir vivre of the alliance being something that was no longer theirs in essence, really, since the fall of the wall, obviously, in the 90s, and the end of the Soviet Union. But obviously, there's been a return to it, which arguably did start with the Georgian War, the Russo-Georgian War, and then in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea. And there's really just been a continuation since then on various fronts, especially with obviously the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So this being said, I don't want to belabor the introduction, really. I'm going to jump in here to the classic agenda, where I'm going to provide the speaking points and kind of walk through what we're doing here, and also gives everybody kind of off ramps to decide when they want to jump off their presentation. That being said, I'll provide a brief personal summary and speak to you about why I'm here speaking this evening and what my goals really are. I'm going to brief you on what Allied Land Command is, specifically the headquarters that I have the privilege of working at, and why it matters, like where it sits kind of in the NATO force and command structures, and what overall it does within the NATO enterprise, and kind of how it changed my perspective on things and how my mileage might have varied based on being posted there versus being posted to one of the Joint Force Commands or NATO headquarters, or even Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers of Europe in Mons, Belgium. I'm going to share some pretty humbling stories about preconceived notions. So specifically about what I was thinking when I headed over to Izmir. So Land Command is in Izmir, Turkey, which I'll speak about as well a little bit. And I will also kind of underline some other preconceived notions that I've picked up on from peers, mentors, friends, anybody really that talked about NATO before I went over, and I was trying to inform myself on what the alliance really constituted and what I was going to do as a military staff officer from Canada within this the alliance over in Europe. And then we'll kind of burrow down into the lessons learned. So I'll kind of break that along 3 strands there specifically. And I'll talk about what working for NATO was like, some things I learned there, understanding cultural differences, and then some personal aspects and what that was as a staff officer, hopefully to provide some insight for anybody on the call here tonight that might be from my AOC or even just from any of the various programs that saw the flyer and has chosen to potentially pursue work with NATO in the future, be it as a NATO international civilian or with the OutCan kind of exchange there. And then I want to add a little bit of kind of spice at the end, where I'm going to talk a little bit about what Canada and NATO's future looks like. So right now with my dissertation with King's College London, I'm arguing that it's not necessarily NATO not getting enough out of Canada, but rather Canada that needs to reevaluate what it's getting out of being in the alliance. And that's quite a controversial topic, but I'm hoping to add some insight into why that question is relevant even as of today, and why it needs to be asked, because at the end of the day, I think some of the preconceived notions and just knowledge from the Canadian public, and even within the Canadian Armed Forces itself, that plays in a little bit to why there's been some dissonance in terms of what Canada is contributing to NATO, but also what NATO represents for Canada in terms of alignment with the priorities, right? So obviously with the most recent defense policy, Our North Strong and Free, we've seen the priorities outlined as the home game, so the Arctic region and whatnot, and then the Euro-Atlantic, and then discussion about the Indo-Pacific and what that looks like moving forward in the future with operations such as Horizon and whatnot, and helping out our partners down there, such as with the sub-RFI announcements that's just come out, and discussion today from the Defense Minister, Bill Blair, speaking to specifically what our future looks like, potentially participating in that AUKUS alliance or agreement, pact, whatnot. So some key points really, and just the goal. I want to speak to the importance of NATO for Canada here, but I also want to speak to the importance of Canada, NATO for Canada, and Canada for NATO. So kind of like reciprocally in that sense. I'm going to look to underline how we can leverage some opportunities within the alliance to rework our own structures. That's kind of going to be a theme that's going to come along as well. And it actually forms the basis really overall of what my dissertation is going to look like when it does get published next year. So a personal summary, it's ironic because of one of the logical fallacies we've been studying on the Army Operation course over the past 2 weeks is appeal to authority. So although I'm going to list a little bit about my background here, it doesn't necessarily make me the expert. And the disclaimer that I definitely need to lead with is one of two things. One, the opinions I'll express here and the discussion here are my own. They don't represent the Canadian Armed Forces necessarily in any way, or any of the other organizations that I work with, volunteer with, or do research with, which I'll speak to about in a moment. And also, your mileage may vary. And this is one of those classic Reddit acronyms, and I wanted to share it because just because I went through a specific experience with NATO doesn't mean that yours might have been beforehand. Not that it might, be in the future. So as Dr. Eustace has mentioned, I may have the opportunity in the next 2 years to deploy as a subunit commander with the engineers over to Latvia with the new multinational brigade, Latvia, as part of the forward land forces on the eastern flank for NATO in Eastern Europe. And I am absolutely sure that my experience there, should it come to fruition, will be completely different from what I experienced having worked in a tactical strategic, I know it sounds kind of weird, but this is the reality of LANCOM, tactical strategic headquarters as a staff officer working in Turkey, specifically within the military engineering division. So please don't take this verbatim, as gospel, but rather with a grain of salt. And I hope you do take away kind of the lessons identified on your end, lessons learned on my end, to potentially kind of add value to what you have potentially going over as an audience member, or even just your understanding of NATO itself and what Canada's role is within it. So previously experienced, and kind of as I mentioned, my background, I'm a Canadian military engineer, Army officer. So I graduated from the Royal Military College of Canada in 2016 and headed over to Gagetown at the Canadian Forces School of Military Engineering, pursued my training there, and was subsequently sent to 2 Combat Engineer Regiment, with which I was pleased and privileged to deploy to Ukraine in 2018 to do small teams training missions, a lot of training for the Ukrainian Armed Forces at the time and the security forces of Ukraine. And the Operate Unifier mission at the time, which was based out of Yavoriv and Lviv, was evolving. So that gave me kind of my introduction, in a sense, to what international missions and partnerships look like at the time. Returning from Ukraine, I spent a little more time at 2 Combat Engineer Regiment, and then I was posted as an instructor at the Canadian Forces School of Military Engineering. And from there, that's when I essentially post-COVID went over, deployed, was posted to Allied Land Command in 2021. So you can see actually in the picture here is a peer of mine that graduated with me in 2017 from the engineering operations, basic engineering officers course. And he and I actually were both posted at the same time to Izmir, so sharing that. But within my NATO experience specifically, so I arrived in July 2021, and I was posted as the Staff Officer Coordination for the Assistant Chief of Staff for Engineering Division within the NATO structure. So this was a new introduction to me and how things work at the real strategic and operational level headquarters in terms of how their structures work. Essentially, they have full colonels that are assigned various continental staff functions, so 1 through 9, and then like medical engineer. Those report through directorates. So usually there's 3. They'll have operations, support, and plans. So we reported through the operations at the time, and those will report to the chief of staff and then the commander of the headquarters itself, which are 3- and 4-star generals respectively. And I'll kind of get into the overall structure of NATO in a few minutes when I talk about where Allied Land Command kind of sits in there. But what it basically meant being staff officer coordination was I solved problems. So for the military folks that were that are online or that are going to watch this in the future, I was basically the fixer in the sense that I was the operations officer, but also at the same time the administration officer for the division. And when it came down to it, I was working with a lot of specialists who were generally post-unit command lieutenant colonels and colonels. And when they had issues, they just came to see me. And if that meant it was, reviewing a land coordination order that was going to get published for the command, for the dictating what the operational tempo was going to look like for the corps, that was what I did. If it was somebody asking me to come fix their printer, that was also what I did. So it really just came down to what the situation dictated at the time. And as we'll get into it in a couple minutes here, as the invasion of Ukraine did kick off, but even earlier than that, when the amassing started on that border in November 2021, that's when kind of things changed in terms of what the scope of my work was. Outside of that, I got involved early with environmental protection, actually, with NATO, as the secondary duty for my position was as the environmental officer for the headquarters. That saw me kind of grow in scope, especially as some of the topics that are listed here took prominence over the past few years with NATO. So, for example, climate security. So the Secretary General, obviously, of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has recognized that climate change is the defining challenge of our time and our generations, really. So climate security has kind of taken on a new role and a new importance within the alliance, and not just the military aspects, but overall at the political level as well. And this has also led to the creation of the Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence in Montreal, Canada. So we hold that now, who's actually hosting their first climate security conference in Montreal in October. So that's to come. It was just announced today in partnership with CDAI. Other pieces I worked on, of course, were energy security. So I was privy and privileged to be at the table to develop the operational energy concept within NATO, because NATO was finding that it had a problem with issuing strategic direction on how energy was going to work within the tactical formations. And then there was a gap between kind of that strategic direction and the actual tactical outlines and tactical procedures that were undertaken at the core and below level. So the operational gap there was trying to kind of take that strategic and political direction and make it digestible for the feeder, essentially, elements. And at one point I did serve for 2 years as a privilege as the NATO chair of the Environmental Protection Working Group Doctrine and Terminology Panel. So that was hosted essentially twice a year with ongoing work through the NATO Standardization Office, where we partook essentially in reviewing high-level doctrine for NATO, terminology pieces, and what it meant for the environmental protection world. So I did that for 2 years on behalf of Allied Land Command, after having had the opportunity to attend various working groups beforehand and conferences specific to environmental protection. And that's one that I recently had to step down from, obviously, upon my return in July 2024. But as I mentioned, so why am I here to speak to you today? And where does this take us, really? This is an example here of me showing up to the Alliance, obviously, in a specific job and branching out and kind of grabbing things. And there's many different positions and many different Canadians, actually, that I met while I was overseas, in Europe, in Allied Land Command itself. One of which I'll give the shout out, actually, to the new Sergeant Major for the Army Staff College here, is Chief Warrant Officer George Martin, and he was the command senior enlisted leader for Allied Land Command with me. So we kind of both came over together to Kingston, but it goes to show it's a small army, but everybody's got kind of mileage that's going to vary in this regard. All right, so NATO Article 2, I want to highlight this one because it becomes important, and it's part of the reason we're going to have the discussion as we go forward So I'm not going to read it to you verbatim, but it's really saying that the parties are trying to go beyond being a military alliance. They're looking to promote conditions of stability and well-being economically, politically, and it's about, going beyond just having military forces amassed and countering the Warsaw Pact at the time, or whatever threat may exist now, be it the days of Afghanistan or the ADO, so the dispersed operations, and now obviously Russia and what that has become. So this all to say, though, I do underline that it is known as the Canadian article. So historically within NATO, this one was one that Lester B. Pearson fought for quite hard to make sure it was included, so that NATO became more than just a military alliance, a pact or an agreement, a la World War I or World War II, just following, obviously, the end of the Second World War in 1949. So it's an important one, and it's going to kind of echo what we're going to speak to in terms of this being about more than just military experience that's taken aboard, really growth as like people and as partner nations or even allied nations that are sending people and staff officers and commanders really to work as groups, to work as teams within these different headquarters for the promotion of the rules-based order and really for the promotion of values such as democracy and freedom and liberty to express themselves, despite the fact really that we have potentially misaligned or differently aligned values in some regards. So the perfect example, honestly speaking, just from my experience, was being in Turkey, which has seen a significant amount of democratic backsliding occur in the past, decade plus, including with the attempted coup in 2016. But all this to say, like, we were every day, showing up to the headquarters in Turkey, working with Turkish officers and NCOs. And happily being part of essentially that group towards the NATO ideals, and what NATO was looking to do overall with Allied Land Command and furthering its mission. So really, when it comes down to it, I really want to echo how this is going to be important because it's going to be reflected as a key theme throughout the entire presentation, that NATO goes beyond the military. It goes beyond the politics and it goes beyond the military forces we provide, but it fosters conditions that allow essentially for that interchanging and those common aligned values between the nations that make up the alliance. So just wanted to kind of put that piece of history there because it kind of provides a cornerstone, a keystone really for the presentation as we go along. And then, so obviously here, this is an example. So this is the 26th Environmental Protection Working Group that occurred at NATO headquarters. So this is from 8 to 10 November 2023. And this is for the many speakers in the audience or future many audience members that are going to review this, as well as those with the YouTube link later, that said that it was basically just a 3-year vacation for myself. But you can see from the top right corner, I actually did put in some work as we kind of went to these conferences and made sure that the environmental protection doctrine and whatnot and activities were advanced forward. But this is an example really of that Article 2 in terms of convening together from many different nations, many different areas across Europe, across the world, really, as we had some partner nations and different partners attending to these events and coming together really and working on aligned missions, aligned direction, and common goals and objectives. So coming back to Allied Land Command, because we've talked about it a little bit, and it's important to understand kind of what the NATO structure looks like in a sense, and I'll try and kind of give it some allusion to kind of what Canada does. Allied Land Command specifically is a theater component command. So what NATO has underneath the military committee and underneath the Supreme Headquarters Allied Power to Europe, SHAPE, which is in Mons, Belgium. On the Allied Command Operations side of the house, which is essentially the military forces, is the NATO force structure and the NATO command structure. So on the force structure side, that's really the different corps that countries are providing on a rotationary basis that constitute the troops that would go out and actually partake in military operations or activities, should they be called upon. And there's rotating roles such as the NATO Response Force, the very high readiness joint task force, and these entities train and are certified on a rotating basis to be prepared to go and undertake any mission that NATO might provide. But at the same time, there's a NATO command structure, which is a static and kind of permanent structure. And it employs staff officers on exchange, or that are sent from the various NATO nations and even partners across various areas. So there's Allied Land Command, which is a theater component command, and it sits in Izmir, Turkey, which is just on the west coast of Anatolia. And there's also the Maritime Component Command, which is Marcom, and that sits essentially in Northwood in the UK. And then Ramstein, which is the Air Component Command, which is AirCom, and that sits obviously in Germany and provides kind of that theater component command and air advice essentially for Supreme Headquarters. So what essentially they do, the TCCs, the theater component commands, is they provide kind of like their specific expertise within their domain up to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. So SACEUR, which is currently General Cavoli, and that's via SHAPE. So that's in Mons, Belgium. So Supreme Headquarters, really. So they differ from the Joint Force Commands, which actually hold terrain in a sense. The joint operations, so the Joint Force Commands essentially hold joint operating areas and oversee kind of the joint operations should they be required. As well as kind of designated geography. So for all my Army Operations course peers, it's really an area of operations they hold with an area of influence and an area of interest in that regard. So there's 3 of those currently. There's Joint Force Command Naples, which is really the southeast area. So think like the terrorist band or the band of interest in kind of the Northern Africa and Sahel and Middle Eastern region, as well as kind of the southeastern flank. And then there's the Joint Force Command Brunson, which is in the Joint Operations Area Center. So they see a lot more of Northern Europe and essentially like Western Europe as well. And then there's Joint Force Command Norfolk, which is recently coming aboard as at their operational function point, and that's obviously the United States, and they're covering essentially the Atlantic. So they're much more predicated on maritime operations, but they're slowly coming to fruition there. And I don't want to situate the estimate too much, but there's been talks, of course, of having a new Joint Force Command looking at being established more in the northern region. Just purely based on the accession of the 2 new members, so Sweden and Finland, which both happened during the time that I was there. Very interestingly. But all this to say, when it comes back down to it, the interaction is important between the theater commands and the Joint Force Commands because they all have different roles, but it also creates some frictions, especially when a land component command, as an example from LANCOM, might kind of move into an area and work with the Joint Force Command, despite them already being established static headquarters, and both of them having 4-star generals that are commanders, as an example. So I actually had the pleasure to see how this interacted at the strategic level. It's not me just talking based on doctrine or having read publications. I was sent from Allied Land Command to Supreme Headquarters in July of 2022 to be a liaison officer for 1 full month at Supreme Headquarters from my command. And this is something essentially we do on a rotating basis from the different commands, especially as part of the NATO response to Russian aggression in Ukraine. Basically to see and make sure that the main working groups and the battle rhythm events that are occurring within the Supreme Headquarters are attended by at least representatives of the different commands, especially when they're in higher classification areas that necessarily cannot be done over MS Teams or Zoom or whatever it might be that prevents us from being able to be in attendance, obviously. So as that representative there from my command, I was able to kind of get an idea of where things fit. I sat in a room and worked in the Joint Operations Center with various other liaison officers from the different Joint Force Commands and theater component commands, and it gave me some insight in kind of how the frictions have worked in terms of having the goals that the command wanted that are aligned, obviously, with NATO as a whole, the military committee, Supreme Headquarters itself, but also do create some friction sometimes in terms of what personal goals the commanders might have at different Joint Force Commands. So for example, Joint Force Command Brunson and Joint Force Command Naples having different joint area of operations, still kind of having some overlap and trying to figure out where that border of overlap works and how to massage that between the two to ensure that there's, economy of effort, concentration of force where it needs to be, and just balance across that eastern flank. But obviously post invasion here, and these are the new rules that I'm talking about. So LANCOM kind of has had a schism in the sense that they're now providing a combined land forces component command, so otherwise known as a CFLIC, and a land component command. So this will see the headquarters kind of break into 2, and this is as I left in July 2024. This is really coming to effect. And the CFLIC essentially is what does like the overall strategic theater planning for the land domain, and they report directly to SACEUR and SHAPE. Whereas the land component command can be employed essentially as a multi-core land component command. So they oversee kind of like more than one corps, which would be operating within a joint area of operations. And they report up to the Joint Force Command, which would be assigned to a joint area of operations, should we get to that point with a NATO Article 5 type response. So why am I telling you about this? Why does this matter? And what's the point essentially of briefing what Allied Land Command is? Well, it's important because not only does the Army not have like similar structures in Canada that kind of align with this specifically. I mean, we do have CJOC, which is our force employer, and then the other L ones, which are necessarily like force generators. So the frictions are different, right? And we have to understand as Canadians and as like a nation, when we send people over to work within NATO and the NATO force structure, the NATO command structure, wherever they might end up, that they might have different roles. So somebody being employed in the NATO force structure is going to have a very different role than somebody being employed in the NATO command structure, like where I was at. And this can be confusing. And really, I didn't get any training on this before I went over. So this was kind of ad hoc things that we had to pick up on the go. Which can create friction, obviously, too, trying to integrate into a new environment, which is already culturally difficult based on being overseas in a different place. Trying to conduct a no-can move, which in itself is difficult. It's still occurring now for me on the return end, just out of the hotel after 80 days. But also, especially considering now that we have the multinational brigade in Latvia, which has been scaled up and we're working on, as well as Task Force Latvia, where those fit in and how that they interact with things like the NATO force integration units or the different component commands. And that's really important, especially in terms of how we're working through those frictions to ensure the headquarters are actually bringing forward and working with their personnel that they deploy out there and achieving their mission in concert with what the nations want through the NATO force structure system, and in terms of what they're sending in terms of like the corps, right? So if we're looking at things like the NATO response corps from Italy, or might have a different approach than the NATO response corps from Greece might have, or even the one from Turkey, obviously, or the Eurocorps, that's a joint venture between various nations in Central Europe. And it's important to understand how these align based on standardization, because one of the key principles of NATO is really that interoperability piece, which allows the forces to kind of be employed differently by the alliance as a whole. All right. So when it comes to Allied Land Command, really, I wanted to highlight here like just that idea in terms of what the different influence in terms of partners and advocacy work. So this is a specific slide I've taken from a previous presentation that the military engineering aspect gives. So this is just giving you an idea of just the mil-eng aspects, right? But there's many other aspects. So like you can think of any specialty within the military, be it target acquisition, for example, within the artillery world, or fires, within the plans world, the medical support world. Every single one is going to have different charts that look like this, but they're going to be very similar in the sense that they all interact with the same type of partners. So obviously the strategic commands of Allied Command Operations, or SHAPE, which is at the top, as well as Allied Command Transformation, which is kind of similar to our CAD-TC in a sense, that they're looking at, or even CALIC as well. They're looking at training for NATO. They're looking at the standardization of the future events look like for NATO, and what the enterprise really looks like moving forward. And then obviously the single service components, so LANCOM, AirCom, and MARCOM, which are to your top left of the screen there, and the Joint Force Commands to the top right. But also, you have to understand there's like the communities of interest, right? So NATO nations are involved in steering committees and various different conferences and working groups that oversee development of things like doctrine. They oversee like the force generating conferences. They oversee the various events that essentially make up the body and the background of work that forwards NATO as an alliance and an enterprise, right? So it's not enough to just have these static headquarters that are kind of churning out the policy and the doctrine and the direction. Obviously, the alliance members make up the institution itself. So they do have to provide kind of insight in terms of what they see aligned with their national goals and their domestic policy, but also in terms of what policy gets drafted for NATO itself. So for example, I had the privilege to go to various military engineering working groups where we saw many different beliefs or doctrines and policies specific to military engineering brought to the table, and discussion occurring between NATO nations, but also the various entities such as LANCOM or MARCOM or whatever it might have you, speaking to what the future of military engineering doctrine should look like from a NATO perspective, a NATO standardization piece. So that encompasses the working groups, and for any of these these specialties, there's the centers of excellence that are constituted. So for example, the Military Engineering Center of Excellence, which is found in Ingolstadt, Germany, or even the new Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence, which is now found in Montreal, Canada. These have a say. So as much as they're not part of the NATO enterprise per se, or fall within the command structure, they can develop policy, and they're working on it with in terms of military posted billets, but also academics and civilians that are working on advancing this. Obviously, there's also the various NATO support organizations, so the NATO Standardization Office and NATO Support Procurement Agency, which are both listed on the bottom with their emblems there. And there's various other ones as well, such as the NATO Science for Peace programs. And these are various, you could almost think of them like as institutes or think tanks and whatnot that are supporting, or even agencies or organizations that are supporting NATO holistically within their own specialties and their approaches, right? So as an example, NSPA, when the earthquakes in Turkey happened in 2020, I believe it was 2022 or 2023, when these earthquakes occurred, NSPA was quick to deploy some of their deployable camps, which were then used to house some of the affected members from the areas of Turkey. And there was obviously a NATO response that was kind of deployed in support of the nation, which was really good because that actually fell into the Article 2 piece there of NATO in terms of promoting that prosperity among member nations. And it was especially important considering at the time Turkey was going through some frictions with NATO based on their interactions with Russia and kind of contravention to the accession process, which is well within their rights for Sweden and Finland at the time, just based on what was going on. Obviously, it's a topic for another time in terms of the Black Sea Grain Initiative and where Turkey sits. But I know Dr. Chris Kilford, who's a future speaker for RCMI, is going to cover that in depth. So I hope I didn't steal Dr. Eustace's thunder there, but that'll come at the end of the presentation today. And then finally, bottom left, the NATO force structure, ground response forces, land. So specifically the different corps I had mentioned, so such as NATO response, NATO Rapid Deployable Corps, Italy. There's Eurocorps, German Netherlands Corps. I'm not going to mention them all, but essentially every nation or groups of nations provide, corps or tactical level units at those higher levels that are on standby or that are doing rotationary billets or roles within their piece to kind of serve NATO constitutions. So things like the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, the NATO Rapid Reaction Force, things like these have the corps that are rotating through and filling these billets on a rotating basis, similar to how in the brigade in Latvia, we rotate through the different brigades, be it 2 brigade from Petawawa or 5 brigade from in Valcartier or 1 brigade from out west in Edmonton. That's the similar kind of rotation that takes place. And of note, something I learned when I came over is that Canada actually doesn't partake in the NATO force structure, as having its own organization. So obviously we don't have a corps that's part of the rotationary process, but we do have many individual officers and individual NCOs that are within the NATO force structure at these corps. Specifically, we've had an immense amount of senior commanders filling those assistant chief of staff roles, but also command senior enlisted leaders. So the chief warrant officers that are going over and filling the core senior leadership positions as the sergeant majors, as those NCOs, and providing that insight and advice, which has been great for Canada. From that individual perspective, especially in terms of building that professional NCO corps, which is something we have seen has been a difference maker for the conflict in Ukraine, with the Russians not really having that per se, but the Ukrainians having been working on that really since 2014 and beforehand with that NATO interoperability piece, the Joint Military Training Group Unifier or Ukraine, which was led by the Americans, but also Operation Unifier from a Canadian perspective. So all this to say, definitely the important piece here, as it comes back to it, is the NATO Article 2 is we do more than just military stuff. So we're involved with things, we're developing policy, there's other agencies that are involved, and that kind of goes through with the committees and where that also falls. So NATO becomes more than just like an alliance or necessarily kind of like a headquarters or different headquarters. It becomes a network. And you really have to get out to come to some of these events and work with different entities outside of your own command or your own chain of command to make sure that you're kind of being included in what's going on and really to understand what the enterprise or the alliance as a whole, as an institution, is looking to do beyond just the kind of the blinders or the scope of what just your command is trying to do, or even just your division, as an example. So some preconceived notions. And so before I went over to NATO, obviously I was told about the post. I'm going to give you the story in just a minute here, and it's a little humbling. I wanted to kind of outline this because it's important to understand where that dissonance is kind of created, right? So on the right here, you have an image credit from John and Hughes Wilson, so it's a British cartoonist. It's a fairly old, actually, drawing, but we did have a copy of it that was printed and put into the operations center in Izmir, Turkey at Land Command, and it gives an idea of kind of like where the nation's going to play, from an off-color, off-putting type piece, but obviously also falling in within those stereotypes that are generally, based on fact in some regards. So to give you the idea and the story of how I was posted to Landcom, having gone to the Canadian Forces School of Military Engineering in 2019, I was eager to go back on deployment. So, post-COVID, around the end of the 2020 time frame, I lingered at the end of the day one day near my commanding officer's office, and I was waiting kind of for the adjutant and the DCO to be gone, and I kind of just jumped in at the last minute just before she was about to leave, and I told her I wanted to be deployed if it was possible in the next little while. And I was thinking, to myself, one of those 1-year CJOC outcans, be it on Proteus in Jerusalem, or Soprano in Sudan, something like that. But she said, as the deputy director of the engineers at the time, well, hey, we just had a 3-year outcan open up in Izmir, Turkey. Would you like to go do that? And I said, thinking to myself, oh, this is quite a thing. I was like, well, I need to talk to my spouse. And so I ended up going back and speaking to my spouse, and we kind of jumped both feet in, also understanding that, if you've asked for one thing and you're provided another opportunity, if you say no to the opportunity, it isn't necessarily well reflected on you in the long term. And I saw this as a great adventure, great experience, especially to learn about something that was new for me, having not worked in NATO. I'd gone to Unifier in 2018 in Ukraine, but I had not been to Operation Reassurance in Latvia. So I had very little knowledge of NATO, and especially very little knowledge of Turkey. Enough of that to the fact that when I sat down for my exit interview with my CO, I told her that I was very excited to be working with one of NATO's newest members, Turkey. And she corrected me in saying, do you mean one of the members since the 1950s, one of NATO's oldest members? So that was quite a humbling experience, but also kind of went to show just about my knowledge of the alliance at the time. And I'm also happy to say, not to, self-depreciating in a way, but that I know many other people that feel the same way. They don't necessarily understand the history of the alliance, especially going into it. And that kind of fosters into the second point here, is that there's a preconceived notion from a Canadian perspective in many regards that NATO billets are a good go, that you're going over there is like, a golden handshake. It's supposed to be an end of career posting, or that you're going essentially to just kind of travel a lot. And I know that a lot of people that might have seen my social media over the past 3 years might have that notion that all I did was travel and there was very little work done. But the reality is we weren't, posting photos of us working on regional plans, or sitting and running, operational planning teams on recurring basis to try and, support the Ukrainians or prepare the NATO plans on the eastern flank, or whatever it might have been at the time. And one of those preconceived notions I want to say really is that can cause frictions, especially when you show up there. If you have that preconceived notion that you're not going to be doing some work, especially with the invasion of Ukraine having occurred. Now, specifically for Landcom, that's another preconceived notion, is it was known as the Combat Readiness Evaluation Headquarters. So obviously, since all of the corps that I mentioned from NATO force structure have their own command abilities, when they were deploying, or if they were ever intentionally going to deploy, in a situation of some sort for NATO Article 5, they didn't necessarily need another command element placed over them, from our perspective. So we were really just busy doing combat readiness evaluations, but this obviously completely changed in November of 2021 as the massing of troops for that exercise happened on the Ukrainian border by the Russians and Belarusians, and then that was obviously turned into the invasion, which occurred in February, to the point where that there were some people that were sitting in the headquarters the morning the invasion began and said that it wasn't a thing. It was disinformation. It wasn't real. And it took some people like quite a little whiles to realize what was actually transpiring, and how, NATO had gone from being described as brain dead from Emmanuel Macron back in the day to becoming what was realistically like the final cornerstone, or like the final gateway almost, or even bulwark towards like the Russian advance in Europe, especially in the Baltic areas. And it's kind of where it's gone from there. And that friction coming in with that mentality. Sorry, I've gone back one. That friction with that mentality, for some staff officers coming into NATO, specifically at Land Command as like a good go, created issues in the sense that we had also some nations that had national caveats, which I'll get to in a little bit, that prevented them from being in deployments, that prevented them from working certain long hours. But then you would have other nations, and I'll specifically highlight my Polish colleagues, who went all in because they understood kind of what the meaning and what the gravity of the situation in Ukraine meant. So they were working much longer hours, despite some other nations, members not kind of grasping the severity of the situation at the time. Obviously, kind of that massaged out over time, especially at Landcom, as we saw. And people, I would say, arguably, that everyone's really gotten on board with what's going on in Ukraine and what NATO's kind of role to play in there is 2 years later. But the argument can be had in terms of if NATO did what was required at the time and if it was a fast enough response. This has obviously led to some of the NATO acronyms that are derogatorily, used at the time. So things like nothing after 2 o'clock, the North American Travel Organization needs alcohol to operate. These are all acronyms that kind of stemmed from stereotypes and just ideas that NATO was a good go, was a place to kind of go retire, was a place to just relax and take a break, take the foot off the brake from time in the national streams. And realistically, I would argue, from a personal basis, that I wasn't necessarily forgotten while I was over in my my NATO billet, but communications with the home front and the home team became a little more strenuous, a little more difficult, and it was difficult sometimes to kind of have that understanding of what I was doing. There was people that actually I had discussions with at some point, and they asked me how I was enjoying my time, over in Italy, despite the fact that I was clearly posted in Turkey and the Middle East at the time, and just went to show that kind of that dissonance that the geography kind of creates, but also just being out of the Canadian stream and the Canadian reality of the Army, the Canadian Armed Forces, the culture change, and what's transpiring here in terms of organizational, institutional goals, and what NATO was looking at, at the forefront at the time, with the invasion of Ukraine. So what? So it really the key takeaway here, and you'll see so what in a few of the slides here, obviously, because it's the estimate way from the Army Operations course right now, is that it was very difficult to prepare and have the proper mindset or goals, going over, as they were unclear. And this did sometimes attract the wrong people into crucial key billets. And this resulted in some key players being the ones that were relied upon within the headquarters to do everything. And this is beyond the military planning, but it kind of draws back to the NATO Article 2 concept in the sense that NATO really was about being a network, right? It was certain key players within the headquarters that were pushed forward that had to get the job done. And what makes different, because it's very similar to that in many aspects in organizations, be it the Army, be it civilian organizations, over in the private sector. But the reality was these were international, multinational officers thrown in together, not having worked and not having the same alignment necessarily. I mean, we do have the interoperability, but they're different, and we're working on aligned goals for the headquarters per se. But at the same time, we have our national goals that we're keeping in mind. And at the end of the day, the importance, I think, the takeaway here is making sure that people going over have the preconceived notions that are aligned with what they're going to be doing properly. Going over to work with NATO, but also have an understanding of what the dynamics of the alliance and what their specific headquarters is going to actually look like. So coming into now, I'd like to just jump into the lessons learned now. So we're going to talk specifically about 3 streams, specifically of these lessons identified and lessons learned from my perspective. So specifically working for NATO, the first one I wanted to mention is the importance of networking. And the fact is, the idea that we show up there and we have to create essentially networks of other officers with people we've never met, right? So in the Canadian Army, as an example, when you're posted somewhere, you will inevitably know people that you have worked with before in previous iterations, or you've been on previous courses with. For example, just coming on the Army Operations course this past 2 weeks, many people I graduated the military college with, many people I've been on deployment with. It's been good to see them and interact with them. When I showed up to NATO Allied Land Command, I knew one person, and he was coming in with me, and he's pictured there below in the middle of this picture, and that was it. I met people over time, and I found that NATO, some of the key players within the alliance and whatnot that have been working in NATO for quite a while, have developed relationships and created their own little NATO network. And it's something I did over the course of my 3 years there. And even today now, I kind of reach out to friends and peers and mentors and whatnot that I have within the alliance, especially when it comes to having questions or problem sets potentially that I can't answer as a Canadian, and that I might need some insight on from like a national perspective, or even just like in kind of dealing with problems that might be pertaining to specific regions of the world, that might be, better understood by a different nation, or a partner alliance, or a partner, in that respect. To this effect, the importance of having a network. Every officer is a planner, and I'm going to bring this kind of a catchphrase here up for a minute, because it's going to kind of segue into a story about how the networking comes to fruition, how it's important. So as an example, in 2021, when the invasion was imminent for many of us, and we were seeing it happening. At the end of the day, one day I was heading back home from work, and the headquarters was about 40 minutes actually to drive from my house. So it was 40 minutes each way going into work every day. And I had told my boss, had the discussion. I shouldn't say told my boss. I had the discussion and massaged the idea that if when I left work for the day, I would only come back for incredibly serious events. Like, please don't call me back to fix a minute sheet or whatever it might be. And I'll tell you, I only got called back once the entire time that I was deployed to Lancom, and it was in November of 2021, when we were preparing essentially for the imminent invasion. So we had been giving essentially warning orders at the time to prepare for potential deployments to the eastern flank, specifically in Romania at the time, which would later on become the enhanced vigilance activities presence, and the forward presence essentially that is now in Romania with the French brigade / battle group there. But at the time, we were looking to bring people together to have this discussion, and they realized that it wasn't effective enough, and they didn't have the right people specifically in all these positions. And also, many people had gone home for the evening, since it was at 7 p.m. that I got the call. And I was brought back to the headquarters just purely based on the fact that the person running the land operational planning group knew me, had worked with me in some capacities at various events, and knew that I had been to Romania, knew that I had been to Ukraine, and wanted some insight, some experience as part of that planning group, right? And that's just one example of kind of how the networking piece expanded, in the sense that you don't always end up calling people that are working on the right jobs, or understanding kind of how the structure itself works. So for example, like, I don't know necessarily how the structure works at Supreme Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk. But what I can say is that I know some people that are there, and if I had questions about it, I would pick the phone up or send them an email to just inquire, and they would be happy to kind of shed some light on what that situation is. Just like how when people were coming over to Allied Land Command, I was happy to kind of reach out beforehand and speak to them about what the reality of the situation they were walking into, be it with the frictions of being in Izmir, Turkey, what it was like just administratively, or what Allied Land Command was looking to do in terms of being a theater component command within the overall NATO command structure. So definitely the importance of networking there. That was really a key piece to understand, and it's something I learned over time. And I think that goes beyond just the NATO piece, but it's for everyone. NATO is an alliance that runs on teamwork, and it runs on that idea that's underlined in Article 2. So that kind of ties back into that overall theme I'm providing there. Common ground, right? So one of the things that's important for the networking aspect is being able to find common ground, especially when there's misaligned values, such as I've mentioned, with the nations like Hungary or Turkey, or whatever other nations are working through kind of their own stuff right now. I'll tell you that at the headquarters, Canadians. Canadian news didn't often make it out to kind of where we were, unless Canadians were kind of talking about it. But one article that did come out in 2022 was Canada's talking to the importance of convening power. So Global Affairs Canada had released some press conferences, and I believe the minister at the time had spoken to the importance of like what we brought to the table as a convening authority, and how we brought that. And we got a good ribbing for it, I will say. So a lot of the nations gave us a good ribbing, considering the whole 2%, the infamous piece there. But over time, that became more of a reality. I saw that it was a lot of the same nations, the Canadians, the Brits, the Americans, that would look to do that, ironically, at the conferences, and bring people together and align them and find that common ground in terms of the cultural differences, to bring teams together on short notice and get them working towards goals that were important for the alliance or for the headquarters or whatever it might have been at that time. And that kind of came back to the idea again in my mind of Article 2, and how NATO is more than just a military alliance, where we're lining up, subunits and units of different nationalities on the eastern flank, ready for a potential Russian invasion, but rather we're looking to foster a network and interoperability, which is done by finding common ground, building teams that eventually grow into networks, and creating that globalization in a sense, and that opening up of lines of communication between the different allies that ultimately allows us to prevail. When we're not working in silo, we're working in conjunction and as a team, with economy of effort, concentration of force, and the balance, and all these different aspects from the principles of the offense and different aspects of the military, but also just what our principles of being as part of an effective team. And that falls into kind of that piece too of being able to do that effective stakeholder management. So a part-time job, almost a full-time job I had, was planning travel and engagement for the assistant chief of staff for engineering that I worked for as SO's Cord, but also making sure we were at the right events, but also the right person at the right event at the right time was attending. So it's very easy on the NATO circuit, as it's known. If you're not attending events on a regular basis or missing certain key events, you're not meeting with the right players anymore, and you can kind of fall off the track in terms of understanding what's going on. You might miss, for example, 2 military engineering working groups and see that we've gone from speaking specifically to counter mobility and its importance towards mobility, and just in the space of 2 or 3 meetings. So it's important to ensure that we have the right people attending those working groups and those events, but even just the fourth generation conferences, to make sure that stakeholder management is done, and that we're speaking on behalf of obviously our national entities, like our national caveats, and what we need as a nation, as Canadian Armed Forces, as representatives, but also on behalf of our headquarters, on behalf of kind of our streams, be it military engineering, be it fires, be it infantry or armor, whatever it might be. And that's where that convening power and that common ground comes to bear, especially when the specialties or different nations or different teams from different headquarters end up sitting at the same table to discuss things that bring forward the future of the alliance, right? So, for example, the Joint Force Commands are a perfect example. If you speak to anybody that's in Joint Force Command Naples, I shouldn't say anybody, but most, then it will say their mission is one of the most important for NATO right now with that eastern flank. Whereas if you speak to people in Joint Force Command Brunson with Joe as center, they're going to tell you that their mission in terms of supporting, the ongoing NATO support to Ukraine and whatnot, and integrating the new arrived nations of Sweden and Finland is the key aspect of NATO right now. And just being able to kind of effectively manage that and manage expectations between the different stakeholders, that becomes a key piece in terms of being able to work for NATO, and having a little taste of politics, I would say, at whatever level you're working at. So yeah, for working for NATO, definitely the big 3 takeaways there for me was the networking aspect, the common ground, and being able to effectively manage stakeholders at all levels. So evidently, being overseas, being in a different nation for 3 years, especially one so great as and different as Turkey, you need to understand kind of cultural differences. And the first one that you'll hear, and this will be kind of the bane of your existence for anybody going over with NATO, and I know some of the participants right now are probably aware of it, is the word caveat. So national caveats. So different nations have different restrictions that they employ. There's perfect examples thinking back to Afghanistan. Some nations wouldn't let their troops go out at night. Some nations wouldn't let their troops be out without armored fighting vehicles or tank support, or armored support, I should say. Some nations, wouldn't let their troops leave the FOB at all. So these are considerations we have to have, and it's not necessarily something we can kind of crush or overturn necessarily, because it's a national caveat, right? And NATO operates on the idea of consensus, but rather things that we have to work around. So we got to find ways to work around those caveats and the commitments as we can, and best employ people that are showing up to do the job, that generally honestly want to be there and do the work. And that's especially important now, post invasion in Ukraine, especially when we consider countries that have certain desires and needs and goals. So look at Turkey, look at Spain, look at different areas. They're still kind of dealing with those target bans in northern Africa and the Middle East. Turkey is still dealing with the refugee crisis and obviously the ongoing issues in Syria and Iraq on their border, which Dr. Kilfer will speak to more at length. But then obviously on the other side, the Baltics are dealing with Ukraine and the potential Russian invasion there. Poland's dealing with cyber attacks, infrastructure issues, and whatnot. Germany's kind of caught between the two. And everyone's kind of got their own idea of what's going on. So even like Canada, for example, as much as we're supporting Ukraine and doing our Latvian piece with the multinational brigade, we're realistically just restructuring our Canadian armed forces. We're rebuilding the army, trying to figure out this the whole retention and recruitment issues, and looking at modernization, which the army commander's spoken to as of late as being one of his priorities moving forward in terms of getting us on par as part of an interoperable force, right? So the need to arrive really with a basic understanding of differences, and being comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable and not necessarily embracing but addressing that culture shock. That's one we have to have, and that kind of ties into those preconceived notions that I spoke to just earlier. But this being said, obviously working within kind of the idea of culture shock and massaging yourself and going with the flow, there is a need obviously to stand your ground on ethical and moral decisions, understanding that not every nation is undergoing the same culture change. And specifically for me, this means that it can be awkward too, especially as a captain showing up to a strategic headquarters at the time. Sometimes rank doesn't matter, and some of the favorite words that we would hear sometimes from other nations, specifically I would hear was you're not my raider, or the idea that the chain of command on the national basis was different. And this is a key importance, I think, to understand going over to work in the multinational environment, not necessarily just for NATO, because it's important to look to understand this and make your peace, or at least address it, because this is where moral injuries are created in terms of working with other nations if we don't understand or can't come to terms or fruition with really the way they're doing things. And obviously, the sexual harassment, sexual misconduct piece that we're kind of going through here in Canada right now is that key one I would mention as underline as an example, because not every nation is going through that. Not every nation sees that as being a driving force or a need for change right now. So some things that we are seeing, that we saw in Canada in the 80s or 90s as an example, that were considered okay, and we now realize we're definitely not all right, are still pervasive and still permeate kind of the culture that some of the nations bring to the alliance, be it right or not. But that being said, kind of like flipping that aspect, the Canadian way isn't always the right way, and this is something that needed to be understood. And that sometimes the way things were done by other nations, with a more deliberate approach, potentially, or with more, consensus and convening, as opposed to just, sitting down and drafting the plan and getting through it and doing the reps of the operational planning process. It didn't necessarily make it that Canada was the right way. And I think showing up to an alliance like NATO, or any institution or any multinational environment like that, and having an open mind, but knowing where kind of your red lines are in terms of ethical and morality and your values, essentially, that's the right way to work yourself into that, and learn, really, and then being open-minded to learning about what's out there beyond just what the Canadian way looks like. Okay, so some personal aspects, and these are important because this can lead to burnout, but also apathy with staff officers that we saw from the defense perspective when people were showing up. So the first one really is that you have to understand that you're not going to change the alliance on your own in 6 months. As an individual, as an entity, as a nation, it's just not going to happen. There's 32 nations now that are members. We operate on consensus. Some of the nations have underlying tensions. Some of the nations are still realistically within their own Cold Wars with each other, including my host nation at the time, when you understand kind of what the Cyprus situation looks like. But it doesn't mean that people are not going to try to do it. So kind of my advice for that is really to make sure that you kind of temper those expectations, and find outlets to work that energy and that motivation into a specific direction that kind of provides value to the institution and the alliance, but also to yourself in many regards. And the example and the story I like to use is that environmental protection was just a secondary duty for me, but I was happy to engage with Colonel Cindy Legary, who was the strategic headquarters Allied Powers Europe. So at SHAPE, she was the environmental protection officer there. And I was able to attend the environmental protection working group at NATO headquarters just for professional development. And after getting involved with eventually Mr. Johan Rodink, who is here pictured with me, who is the chair of the NATO environmental protection working group, I was offered at one point a seat, and then I was offered the chair of the doctrine and terminology panel. So it was an outlet for me to kind of, self-develop and work and give back to the alliance outside the scope necessarily of what my job was. And obviously my chain of command and my staff, my supervisor at the time were very supportive of this. It reflected well in Canada at the time. That was a way for me to kind of, push that development piece, gain some insight on other aspects of NATO, but also give back and work with that. And I'll tell you, being bilingual came in handy, especially when we were translating some of the records there that we had to use within the doctrine and terminology panel as an example. That kind of segues into that idea of maintaining motivation and discipline. So similar to that roller coaster that you might have heard of about expeditionary deployment or being in a multinational context. After your initial motivation and excitement kind of wears off and the roller coaster goes over the first hill there, the things like the crushing weight of bureaucracy, the ideas of culture shock, those can kind of grind you to a halt, and they can kind of put you in an area that's more difficult to remain motivated within in that regard. And especially when we consider NATO as an enterprise, not just a military alliance, but one that works on with a lot of civilians, political impetus, the need for consensus, stakeholders that are working in for-profit organizations or in agencies or institutions that give back, but are that have their own aligned goals that are not necessarily attuned or aligned with those that you have, those that your nation has, or those that your headquarters have. It can be pretty depressing. It can be pretty defeating, and it definitely creates a culture and it fosters an area of nihilism and really defeatism. And to this effect, 3 years in one single job in the Army is a lifetime. So before that, I think the longest I'd been in one position was one year, and that was just really due to COVID. And you'll even see cycles that kind of recur, right, of things that happen. So when I first got to Allied Land Command, for example, we were trying a new electronic document signing process as opposed to, bringing around minute sheets and having commanders and assistant chiefs of staff just sign documents. And that didn't work. So we still went with the paper copies. And by the end of it, as I was leaving in July 2024, we were looking to bring back the electronic document signing process again. Again, the crushing weight of the bureaucracy, the realities of what an enterprise is, people trying to make changes within their 6 months when they first arrived to the alliance, rocking the boat, not rocking the boat. They're all, aspects and they're all criteria that we have to consider in terms of being within that alliance from the multinational perspective, but also in the fact that the headquarters remain static, despite the fact that the officers that are coming in rotate through, right? This being said, the best way to do so and stay motivated and disciplined outside of just like believing in what NATO is looking to do here is to plan your own future. You have to be your own best career manager, your own best advocate in that regard. So asking yourself questions, like what do I want? But also balancing that with what does my nation need for me to do here? And what does NATO need from me? And as I kind of began my studies concurrently and in corollary to being at NATO, but also like studying, Canada's implications in NATO and international relations at large with King's College London, I realized that one of the best things I could do for my nation while I was there was be a positive ambassador and speak to, the principles that Canada brought to the table, like what we brought there. And for me personally, that was Article 2. It was Pearson's Article 2 as the Canadian article, and speaking to the importance of what Canada brings to the table and what we can do outside of just the military aspects in that regard. And that's almost kind of what had Lester Pearson almost elected as the first Secretary General before he would go on to become Canadian Prime Minister. So this kind of segues into that whole idea of Canada and NATO moving forward. And I just wanted to kind of touch on this because I think it's an important aspect to discuss because obviously we have national implications and the infamous 2% discussion that's ongoing. So the reality is Canada is a founding member and cornerstone of the alliance. We're not at the 2%, but I can tell you personally, from my experience, seeing others involved, that the officers we send in, the staff officers on an individual basis within the headquarters and supporting, such as the C-cells, they put in Herculean efforts. So I'll give you an example without kind of getting into classified details, obviously. I personally know that some of the regional plans that NATO uses right now that they have prepared were written by Canadian staff officers who did the lion's share of the work on various iterations, be this at SHAPE, be this at Land Command, be this at the Joint Force Commands. And kind of when I think about that and what that means for Canada and the reality that we have high value individuals, and we have something to bring to the table, is how do we kind of make that known and how do we ensure that aligns with the alliance and goes beyond just hitting some, arbitrary target, which is put out there. And there's really the idea that we have an opportunity here to realign the Canadian Armed Forces based on the NATO warfighting concept. And as NATO is reinventing itself, the Army can as well, based on things like the multinational brigade Latvia, and then looking at tailoring our forces to the alliance as we rebuild the Army, for example, but also considering how other allies have taken similar approaches. So Poland, as an example, has done this as of recent. In spurring up their defense procurement processes and really aligning themselves with NATO as an interoperability. And them coming off, for example, the Warsaw Pact and just how fast we've seen them modernize their force should be an example to us as Canadians in terms of what we're doing with the Canadian Armed Forces moving forward. Denmark is another perfect example from the 1980s when they were putting caveats into communiques, in the sense they were putting like footnotes saying they disagreed with the consensus issued communiques from the Secretary General, and they were not meeting the funding requirements. And to make up for that, they deployed troops on every single NATO operation they possibly could, to large amounts and with little national caveats. So it's about Canada coming to terms with the fact that if we're not going to put up the 2%, which is a discussion in and of itself, which is being had within the media, we need to find other ways, other opportunities to make ourselves known, and to be kind of like part of the solution, as opposed to just speaking about the problem. And when we consider Article 2, there's many opportunities. So obviously we have the NATO-Ukraine training in Poland, which is occurring on a recurrent basis, and the support that's coming out of the eastern flank. So a picture right here, obviously myself and the other Canadian captain with a Ukrainian colonel, as we had provided mobile training teams in Poland to Ukrainians that came back from Ukraine that had just returned from the front. But there's other ways we can do this. So as an example, that's prominently listed in the lecture. So NATO for the longest time Norway has had a no basing policy with NATO. So they will not host bases from NATO. However, as a return, they've hosted Exercise Nordic Response and Exercise Cold Response within their national territory on many iterations. And this is actually a question I asked the Army commander a couple of weeks ago when we saw him and he visited our course. And I asked him about, is Canada looking at doing NATO exercises in the Arctic anytime soon, particularly considering, the visit the Secretary General had with the Prime Minister and the Minister of National Defense and Foreign Affairs in the past couple of years, because we've been looking at this for a little while. But also to say it's definitely working in the sense that Canada is partaking. We have things like the Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence that's just opened up out of Montreal. We're hosting events. And with the Defense Innovation Accelerator in North America, which is NATO's Diana program, which is essentially startup incubator for defense. We hold a regional office now for North America in Halifax, which is scaling up. And we obviously still have the ongoing commitments to Ukraine. So this is an opportunity for us to do things like align our training efforts. The whole idea of Operation Unifier being aligned for the interoperability piece and the modernization of the Ukrainian forces, which at the time prior to the invasion itself was about using NATO standards and getting them ready for eventual accession to NATO or even the European Union, which is a whole other debate in and of itself right now. All this to say, there's opportunities. They exist, and it goes beyond just the funding requirements. But again, those are conversations that have been held at length, and I think for another time. But when we consider what Canada can do, we have those individual staff officer levels, and we have things in Canada that other nations don't necessarily have. And it's about kind of identifying those as those high value items and moving forward to provide them to the institution and to the alliance. So this is a quote actually from Lester Pearson himself, and I think it's an important one because I've echoed a lot of Pearson throughout this presentation, who is almost, like I said, the first Secretary General of NATO. And his quote here reads, "Unhappily, it is man's weakness to cling to the ideas, the institutions, and the habits of the past, even the recent past, instead of adapting the needs of today and tomorrow." And this was him specifically speaking about NATO at the time, when France originally left under Charles de Gaulle from the NATO command structure and pulled out their nuclear weapons as part of the nuclear planning group, which was a big blow to the alliance at the time. Obviously, considering there was détente with the Russians and whatnot, but there was also then the scaling up of hostilities between the two, which almost reached a head on various occasions with things like Operation Archer or like the Cuban Missile Crisis. This to say, though, when we think about that Article 2 and what that means today, there are opportunities, there are outlets for Canada, and there's ways to do it. So from the political, geostrategic level and insight, It's a way Canada can look at adapting itself and aligning itself with NATO, but also then as a foil at the individual level of staff officers that are going over on OutCan by taking aboard these lessons learned and adapting to the situation at hand and understanding what we're kind of getting into. This is how we best prepare to go over and serve the alliance, not just for the alliance, but also, for the nation itself. And that's kind of what I'm looking to argue within my dissertation with King's College about, how's Canada aligning with NATO and what that future looks like, and how that moves itself forward. So again, some further reading, I just wanted to underline some really key ones here for anybody kind of going over to do a NATO deployment and wants to understand more about the alliance. These 3 books, specifically the 2 here on the left, Canada NATO 49 to 2019 from Jokel and Sokolsky, and then in the middle here, NATO and transatlantic relations in the 21st century. These kind of detail specifically, be it in chapters or be it in large sections or the whole book itself for the far left one, what Canada's roles look like traditionally. And it's provided insight in terms of what Canada's role should look like in the future. And I think that these are important, pieces of scholarly literature that do support that idea of the geopolitical and strategic context, but also that individual staff officers need to read and go through and understand to prepare them really to go over into the alliance and understand what they're getting themselves into and what they're working for, as a whole, in terms of their work strands, be it at the smallest level that reaches itself up to the highest level. The key quote that actually came up just this past week that I think really speaks to it is from Marcus Aurelius, and it says, "Everything you do will eventually echo in eternity," or something to this effect. And it's understanding that, this discussion today we had has been about the highest levels of NATO and what Canada's role is within it, but also just what my experiences were personally at those lower levels. And it's about making that personal balance between understanding what my role to play was individually and how it did ultimately, potentially play into the part, be it if it affected it or not, the highest levels. That was really what the name of the game was at the end of the day. And it's what got me through in terms of motivation and discipline. And it's what got me motivated to be there as part of the alliance and what kept us in the first place as a nation looking to align ourselves with the idea of the principles of what NATO really is and what it represents moving forward, in my opinion, outside of just that military alliance. So that really wraps up kind of what I have to say on an individual basis, kind of about my lessons learned and what my opinion and kind of back pieces on NATO. I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Eustace now and thank him once again for having me aboard to kind of have these ramblings and these discussions as a fireside chat really about what's going on over there from my past 3 years. And again, I'm happy to take any questions as we kind of move through to this.
Alexander, thank you. Perhaps you might want to stop sharing your screen for the moment.
I'm happy to do this.
Okay, there we are. Okay. So we're a small group, that's fine. If there are any questions that you have, please be kind enough to use the raise your hand function or the Q&A function. But we won't take too much time. We're a little longer than we thought we might be, but I didn't want to stop Alexander at any moment because I think, frankly, what you've presented tonight is a very important piece. Okay. And I think the actual audience isn't us. I think we want to capture this and make sure that the folks in the Army get this so that they can help brief folks that are going to go over and serve in NATO. Because I think what you've presented tonight is a very important piece of information to help those folks adapt and succeed in those roles. So it's not that we're not informed by this, we're very informed by this, but I think it's important that we actually captured what you said, because I think it's a very important piece of information. However, having said that, I have a Q&A. If you were returned to NATO, what rank would you want to return as to make an impact? I think that's a good question because, when do you start to have any influence over what's going on there?
It's a great question. I think it's one I think I address a little bit, but I can see how it should be mentioned. So I think the best answer really the standard answer, the DS solution per se, would be lieutenant colonel level is really where you're kind of like the worker that's getting involved in like the nitty gritty plans and like the really important stuff that eventually goes to fruition. You could make the argument that general officer, flag officers are the ones that get to make the decisions for it within the command structures. But I think it's those that are really putting the pen to paper, the hands to keyboards that are getting the work done at that lieutenant colonel and colonel level that make the biggest impact. But I would also conversely argue that it's more about motivation and just finding your place. So I went to conferences or events and whatnot as the chair for the doctrine and terminology panel, and I wouldn't wear my rank. I would just go as Alexander Landry, and people would be surprised to hear that. I really didn't want to reflect that because I didn't want that to become a negative connotation or create dissonance in terms of what I was bringing to the table. It's more based on, like I would say, experience, background, and understanding of kind of like what the alliance is doing, and where that comes to play. So it's there's no perfect answer to this question, but if I was put to the test and said I had to answer, it would definitely be post command lieutenant colonel or colonel ranks, because those are the ones that are getting to make the influence, work at the plans directly, and holding those key nodes between kind of the staff at the lowest levels, but also like the assistant chiefs of staff and the commanders.
Right. Alexander, let me ask you a question. So I'm going to guess, and I could be wrong because we usually have a very informed group of participants in these sorts of activities. But I bet that most people don't know that NATO is going to have the climate security. I'm sure I have the wrong title here. The Climate Security Center of Excellence in Canada. And this is kind of an amazing thing, really. And when you consider how important climate change is to the Canadian government, why don't we know more about this? Why is this not being more publicly touted? Because it's an amazing thing. What's your thoughts on that?
So this is actually a very interesting question. And now this is where I'm going to caveat that this is my opinion, from my experience, both as a research and fellow with the Institute for Peace Diplomacy, and with my background in climate security now. It's interesting that we have such a prominent place to play and that we've kind of brought this forward. But the media releases we've seen have only been limited to kind of like Prime Ministerial Officer PCO releases around the time of the summits when the announcements were made, be it in 2021, subsequently in 2022, and then when we hit operational function point and whatnot. The Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence, if I'm not mistaken, has already achieved its accreditation from the NATO Center of Excellence Accreditation Board through Allied Command Transformation, and they're partaking and hosting the Montreal Climate Security Summit coming up in October with the Conference of Defense Association Institute. So they're pretty prominent. They've got some pretty heavy hitters that are involved, including the Climate Security Association of Canada. And they're doing some good work. They're still really identifying kind of what their environment looks like and trying to get aligned with what that's going to look like moving forward. But you're completely right in the sense that this was a political opportunity to really ring the bell and say, hey, we are doing something that's important. The Secretary General has personally recognized this as being the defining challenge of our time, and it wasn't something that kind of got grasped, in my opinion. It wasn't something that was like heavily advertised or heavily demonstrated as being something that was occurring. Particularly considering where we stand as a nation, especially with a lot of climate-induced incidents that are kind of affecting us, with the various iterations of Operation Lentus and domestic operations in Canada across the whole.
Some people here tonight will remember that, in fact, I can't recall whether it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, that the RCMI actually held their annual conference on the subject of climate security and invited the file holder for DND to speak. Canada had just actually adopted a climate security plan that was congruent with the one that was developed in the United States. And it was only one of many files that this individual held. And So it was an interesting experience, frankly. But so this is a subject that we've, at the RCMI, we've actually addressed this head on, and so it was good to see that this institution or this new organization, this new NATO organization, is going to be situated here. But I just see that this is somehow an opportunity that is not being widely touted and uh, could be better advertised. One of the things that you discussed, and I'm going to just keep this briefly, and then we'll probably start to wrap this up, was when I was looking into NATO's involvement with Afghanistan, and I had to do some research there as far as understanding what NATO was about, and I needed to educate myself, was exactly what you talked about, which was NATO, as a security association, but also NATO as a political society. And I think that's the piece that most people don't really understand, that this is not just about a military alliance, which it obviously is, but it's also trying to ally nations that have common values and common understanding of how the international community should be operating. What's your thought about that in terms of NATO members, such as, for example, Hungary and potentially Turkey, and for a while Poland, that don't want to participate in the military piece, but seem to be wavering from the political piece. How do you think we ought to address those kinds of things?
So I find it incredibly interesting. So as I mentioned a couple of times, the article 2 is referenced as a Canadian article. It was Pearson and his group that originally pushed the article to be included and be one of those cornerstones of the original charter, which made it obviously like a critical piece, but it's one that's kind of not been highly leveraged, right? For Canada, that's kind of mispronounced in the sense that Canada is a very liberalist country. It's a liberalist democracy in many regards, and they believe in the rules-based international order and the realities of needing to kind of make those economic ties, the political discourse, and promoting those values, right? Canadian values, and it was a cornerstone of why we did so many peacekeeping operations for such a long time, in the 80s and 90s. But outside of that, as we kind of came to a head with the invasion that occurred, a lot of the mentalities for the nations that make up the alliance turned more towards realism as a school of thought from international relations, as they saw that obviously we had gone towards a new era. So General Cavoli gave a speech at a Swedish Institute for Defense. I believe it would have been in 2023 or late 2022, and he spoke about the return to hard power. And it's a reality. So I found that a little ironic, actually, that's when the time that Article 2 started getting leveraged in terms of energy security, as they were looking to find economic inroads between the various nations to share things like, to gas and natural gas and oil and whatnot, to try and wean themselves off the dependency on Russia, specifically in places like Germany, Norway, and those parts of Europe. So when it comes to kind of the idea of the dissonance between like the military alliance and wanting to be part of the group and wanting to be part of the club, but then having political aspirations that don't necessarily align with those of the alliance as a consensus, I think it's the necessity of being part of the group and the alignment and the quid pro quo almost that comes to the table in terms of getting things done. So I'll give you an example specifically that deals to Canada and Turkey and the United States, for an example. So Canada and the United States had an arms embargo on Turkey for the longest time following the Azerbaijan-Armenian conflict for the initial sporadic parts of it, as drone parts that were sold to Turkey from Canada were found to be used to attack civilians and misused is the term I'll use. So there was some dissonance between Canada politically and Turkey for the longest time. There were some issues that were fostered, but eventually that arms embargo was lifted as part of the agreement that took place behind the scenes to have Sweden accede to NATO and Turkey kind of like lift their veto that wasn't actually a proposed veto. It was just they didn't go down the road of getting the signatures done because they knew Turkey would say no. Within a week of that happening, the United States and Canada had their need for visas to visit Turkey lifted. So Canadians now can arrive at Istanbul and visit the country and not need to have a visa. And it would be ignorant, I think, to think that those are not correlated, that there's not kind of like a transactionalism that takes place in that regard.
Yeah.
So I guess to kind of bring back that question, like with the alliance, how do these countries kind of still partake despite their dissonance at the political level, domestically, and look strong domestically? It's through transactionalism. It's about saying, hey, I can deal with not having to do this because I was able to get this out of the alliance.
Right, right. I was reading the most recent Foreign Affairs magazine, and one of the articles was called "The Trouble with Allies." So quite quite an interesting article, and really highlights some of the points you just made. Well, folks, I'm not seeing any more hands up, so oh, wait a minute. Maybe I am. Wait a minute. Here we go. Okay. Thank you for an interesting presentation, frame of reference. I know that an important focus of Staff College students is the networking aspect within the international community. They learn during their course activity the importance of the understanding and flexibility that facilitates effective strategic planning and delivery. Do you think it would be helpful to return to your roles with NATO in a more senior role, i.e. Colonel, there you go, after attending the Canadian Forces Command Staff College or similar CAF program specifically designed to develop majors in more senior roles? So I'm going to answer that question, Alex, for you, just to clarify to Diane that Alex is not in the Staff College at the moment at the Canadian Forces College. He's in the Staff College in Fort Frontenac as a captain and on his way to being a major. And there's absolutely no doubt that his experience, and I wanted to highlight this, I think having the experience that he's had at this relatively early stage in his career is going to be immensely helpful. There's no doubt that, there's going to be more NATO in our future, not less NATO in our future. And so I think the fact that he's had this incredible experience at this stage in his career is going to be extremely helpful to him. And hopefully it's going to be extremely helpful to the Canadian Armed Forces more generally, but he's got to get through some stuff like how to defend, a division position, with bombs raining down. There's some stuff he's got to do yet. But it's a great question, but I'm sure that's going to be very, very helpful. So let me wrap this up in terms of thanking some people for this. Let me start off. Okay, I'm going to see if there's one more question that I can just address quickly. Yes, I know, hence the question. I think it would be better for our CAF at this stage to send more senior personnel. Absolutely. No, Diane, I'm going to disagree with you in the sense I think it's important that we send people at all levels. Because it's the junior folks, and I use the word junior in terms of captain, sergeant majors, etc. They're going to be the senior decision makers later on. So, it's not good enough to send a brigadier general or a lieutenant colonel or a colonel who's had no NATO experience into that environment when they're that far along into their career, and bringing such preconceived ideas or ideas from the Canadian Armed Forces that will not fit into that model. So I think that bringing folks like Alex into that environment early on is absolutely the right thing to do. And I think we'll all benefit from that going forward. However, I do respect your question, and I understand the intent of it. So I thank you for that. Therefore, let me wrap this up now by thanking some people. First of all, thanking Thanuja, who is the person behind the screen, who pulls all the levers and makes this all work. So she's always there for us and is extremely helpful and flexible with her assistance. Thank you very much. Eric Morse is our Chief of Communications. He can't be here tonight because he's covering yet another event at the RCMI. But he's the person that puts out the marketing material, the advertising material that gets these things out there on the street. Obviously, I have to thank Alex. We will make sure that you have access to this presentation within the next day or so, and then you can take that and use it as you will. I think it's something that you ought to make available to your fellow AOC classmates at the very least, but you might want to consider firing it up the chain of command and see how that could be used in different settings.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.